Thank you again for taking out time and joining me in today's session. Today is day 3 of our Azure Security series. Again, I appreciate you all taking out time and joining in today's session. Let me go ahead and share my screen and then we will begin this session. A couple of things before I start today's session. The recording of day 1 and day 2 has not been shared yet. We will be sharing all the recordings at once we complete all the 4 days of Azure Security series. So the next session is on the 31st of March. So I would appreciate you joining in that last session, and then post that we will share a download link to download the recording and the slides used during this entire course. Like always, if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat, and I will review the questions throughout the session, possibly during the demonstration time, and then hopefully answer those questions to you as well. Before I begin today's session, I would appreciate if you could participate in the poll and let me know if you're able to hear me loud and clear. Wonderful. I see most of you are able to hear me clearly. In case you're not able to hear me clearly, kindly check your audio settings, or if that doesn't do the trick, then try logging off and logging in back again. Thank you all for participating in the poll. Also, I just wanted to know the persona of each of you who have joined in. I would appreciate if you could let me know what role do you currently play in your organization. Are you a salesperson? Are you from management? Or are you from the technical team, technical pre-sales, or the help desk team? I'll just wait for a couple of extra seconds on this slide. Okay, thank you again for participating in the poll. I see most of you are from technology background. That's good to know. The session is a technical session where we will be talking in depth about certain security features. We'll be going through demonstrations. I don't really have a lot of marketing and sales slides as part of this particular course. But having said that, if you are a pre-sales or salesperson with a lot of technical interest, then these sessions will definitely help you. Also, for support engineers, I would say the sessions are very helpful because you would then know where certain features are configured, how they are configured, where to look for issues, how do you enable, for example, logging and auditing for certain features. So those are things that will definitely help you as well. Thank you for participating in the poll. So let's get started with today's session. So the agenda of today's session are 4 main topics. So we will be looking at Azure Key Vault, a very important security service, but not a lot of, I would say, partners or customers tend to use it. It is also not easy to understand. So during today's session, most of the concepts today are more to do are concepts that you need to first understand, and then we'll also look at how to configure. So these are concepts which sometimes are difficult to explain in slides. So what I've done is I've taken a couple of snapshots, and also during the demo I would be explaining those concepts in more and more detail. So we look at Azure Key Vault, how you could use it, how you can retrieve keys, what are its use cases. We look at application security. So this is where application registration and enterprise application concepts come into place. We will look at storage security. So what are the ways of what are the ways you can restrict people from accessing, how you can control, how you can enable, disable endpoints from accessing it. And last but not the least, we'll also look at a database, which is SQL database is what we'll be looking at. So how you can configure SQL database security. Now, throughout the course, I will be jumping from slides and demo and slides. So At any point of time, if I forget to share the screen, please do let me know in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll hopefully rectify that. A quick introduction about me. My name is Roshan. I've been working with Ingram for close to 4 years now. I'm a Microsoft person. I started working with Microsoft as the first job in 2008. Those days I used to work on SharePoint 2007. Then did a lot of migrations from 2003 to 2007. Then was introduced to BPOS, which is the older version of Office 365. Helped customers migrate Exchange on-prem to Azure. Exchange on-prem to Office 365, Google to Office 365, and even SharePoint on-prem and file server to SharePoint Online. In those were the days when I was introduced to Windows Azure, and my first experience of working with Windows Azure was setting up SQL database, setting up virtual machines to run Active Directory sync and ADFS. And then I started working more and more on Azure. So today I dedicatedly work on Azure, but I do have that knowledge of SharePoint and Microsoft technologies. I'm also an AWS certified architect. So if you do have questions around AWS and how AWS differs from Azure, you can always get in touch with me. I've worked with a vendor like a Microsoft. I've worked with partners like several gold certified partners, and now I'm currently working with Ingram Micro as a distributor. So I understand how the channel model works, how a vendor like Microsoft wants to use the channel and then help customers. And Ingram Micro is a value-added distributor. These sessions, these trainings are part of our value add, and we are very soon coming out with our own services catalog as well. So if you are interested in using Ingram Micro to do security assessments or to do implementations or POCs, feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is displayed on the slide, and we can definitely have a discussion and see how well Ingram can help you with your opportunities. So let's get started with the very first topic, which is Azure Key Vault. So what is Key Vault? So if you talk in simple English, Key Vault is a service that is a storage location for all your secrets. Now, what are secrets? Secrets can be password. Secrets can be public private key, so key pairs. Secrets can be certificates. So these are secrets, and it is a service in which you can store these secrets, right? Now, Azure Key Vault again has different variations or different SKUs, I would say, standard and premium. What is standard SKU of Azure Key Vault? Standard SKU of Azure Key Vault is basically the same service, which definitely again lets you store all these secrets, tokens, passwords, certificates, all these things. But the service in the background within the Microsoft data center, the service where it is stored or the infrastructure which is used to store the keys are shared across multiple tenants, right? So that is what a standard Azure Key Vault offering is. There is also Premier. So Premier means that the same services, so you still are able to store your passwords and certificates and all these things, but now you're storing them on a dedicated infrastructure, right? Just for your own tenant. So that infrastructure is not shared with other tenants in the background within the Microsoft data center. So that's the primary difference between standard and premium. So during the session, as I said, I will show a demonstration of how you can create a key, how to retrieve it, what are the options and things like this, and also use cases. But like I said, at high level, if you'd like to understand what is a Key Vault, Key Vault is nothing but you having the option to go ahead and store your keys, your public private keys, your password, especially your password. For example, let's say you're developing an application and this application needs to connect to a database. Now, whenever you're connecting to a database, you typically have to share a username and password or some kind of account to access that database, right? A lot of customers, what they do, they have this data, the username and password within the configuration file or as part of the connection string. Now, this is not very secure because this file is stored on a server, and if it's an intelligent hacker, he is able to sniff through those lines of codes and get access to that. So what Azure Key Vault is doing is all your secrets are being stored in a secure location, in a safe service. And there are ways that you can configure service. For example, you can configure SQL Server Management Studio from running on a machine to contact Azure Key Vault, retrieve the username and password, and then use that with connecting to the database. So this is one of the examples. The other example is if you would like to do disk encryption. So a lot of customers, again, today are now moving into more and more security enabled infrastructure. Though Azure provides data at rest encryption, but if that disk is downloaded, right? So let's say you have a virtual machine, you have a couple of VHDs. Now this VHDs till the time they are on Azure is always encrypted. So if you try to open them using unauthorized access or using some third-party tools, you'll see gibberish. It's all encrypted. But let's say the same key, the same VHD, if you download into your local laptop, attach it to a virtual machine and use it, then it's not encrypted. It's not encrypted because it's outside Azure. So if you're looking at an option to encrypt those disks as well, no matter whether it is in Azure or outside Azure, that is again where you can use Azure Key Vault, because you can store your key, your encryption key within Azure Key Vault, and use that key to encrypt your disk. And you could pretty much automate it. A lot of my partners, what they're doing is whenever they create a virtual machine, by default, now they're using Azure Key Vault to encrypt the disks, which are also stored on Azure. So it's a good practice to follow. So like I said, how do you access Key Vault? Key Vault is another service. So you definitely need to be part of your Azure AD. So you log in using, you log into Azure. Then if you have access to Key Vault, you're able to access Key Vault, and Key Vault then says what you're able to do, right? Whether you're able to access keys or certificates or secrets, and using that data, you're able to then do your further activities. So let's straight jump onto a demo. I'll show you how you can create a Key Vault, what are the keys, how you can access it, and I'll also show you a couple of use cases within the demo. So let me just double check if everybody is able to see the screen sharing. Yeah. So I'm sharing the screen. This is the Azure portal which I'll be using. So I've created a resource group called Key Vault RG, right? And within this, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a new Key Vault. Now, Key Vault is like a service. So if I go to Marketplace and just search for Key Vault, I can find Azure Key Vault. I'll go ahead and click on Create. I'll say Lab 3 Key Vault. LT Lab 3 or Day 3. Right. So I'll select the region. So these are standard wizards that you would be using. Now this is the pricing tier, right? So standard and premier. So premier are backed up using HSM. So these are stored dedicatedly on a dedicated hardware, and standard is the same service, but in the background, the hardware used is also shared by other customers. So if you'd like to have that extra step, or due to compliance and regulatory rules, if you need to have it on a dedicated hardware, then you can definitely choose premium. It also gives you soft delete. So soft delete is enabled by default, but you can decide for how many days will the soft delete be available, or what is the retention time. And during retention, can you purge your keys, right? So if what does disabled means? It means that you are able to permanently delete the keys when they are in this 90 days of retention. Okay. Now, if you enable, what will happen is, if you enable purge protection in this 90 days, you will not be able to delete the keys. So you will have to wait for 90 days for the keys to be permanently deleted. So that's the difference between disable and enable. So for now, I'll just leave it at disable. Now the next one is access. Now, since Azure Key Vault is a very sensitive, is a very sensitive service because you're storing your keys and certificates, you need to define who and what will have access to Azure Key Vault, right? So you can have virtual machines accessing Azure Key Vault. So for example, like I said, if you have a SQL Server Management Studio running on a virtual machine, and within the Azure Key Vault, you have stored the password of the database administrator, for example, right? Then you need to enable the first option, right? The second option, if you are automating creation of anything within Azure and you need the keys or secrets that are stored in Azure Key Vault, then you need the second option. So ARM template. So for example, if you have a script which goes ahead and automatically creates a virtual machine and creates the disk, and you need Key Vault access in order to create the disk encryption, then the second one. The third one is specifically just for disk encryption. So the second one is for any ARM-based automation, ARM-based template deployment, and you need access to Key Vault. The third one is dedicatedly just for the disk encryption. And then you have vault access policy. So here by default, vault access policy is you can manually define who the user is, what access would he have. So there are different types of secrets. There is a key, there is a secret, there is certificate. So for key, what are the activities can he do, right? So can he get, can the person get the key, update, delete, remove, recover, backup, and even encrypt or decrypt? Secret, right? Again, what are the things he can do? Certificate, what are the things he can do? He or she can do, right? So you can say add policy, you can give a policy name, you can select the principal, so it can be part of Active Directory, it can be identities like managed identities, and you can give them permissions from here, right? So for now, I'll just go back. My name is already added by default, so I'll leave these to three things and I'll go to the next piece, networking. Now, this is something that we covered in the previous section. In the chat, I would encourage you to participate and let me know what is the service called. So if I say private endpoint or public endpoint, what is the service known as? This is something we covered in day 2. So these are known as, if you say all endpoints, this is basically accessing everything. Everything can have access to this. If you say dedicated public endpoint, this is your service endpoints. The last one is private link, right? Where you say that a NIC card to NIC card communication, right? In that scenario, what happens is even the Azure Key Vault will get a private IP address, and let's say you're communicating from a virtual machine, your virtual machine private IP will then communicate with the private IP of Azure Key Vault service. The second one is your private IP is communicating with the public IP of Azure Key Vault, right? So these are ways of how you can further go ahead and provide more security. It's not network security group. Network security group is something associated with virtual machines. These are service endpoints. The second one is service endpoint. The third one is private links or private endpoints. So for now, for the sake of demo, I'll leave it to public. I click next, and I'll just go and create this. Okay, so this should not take too much time to create. There is a question here. Can groups be used instead of user-based vault access policy? The answer is yes, you can use group. But again, I would try to make it as restrictive as possible. So do make sure people who have access to Key Vault, these are users who basically have access to the passwords and things like this. So ideally, the group should not have more than 2 or 3 administrators. but you can definitely give a group instead of just a user. That's possible. Okay, so the key vault is created. So within the key vault, what are the things we can do? So like I said, under settings, I can create keys. So this can be public private keys. I can create secrets. Secrets are, in simple English, passwords, right? These are passwords. Certificates, you can go ahead and create certificates. Access policy, we just saw this, right? Networking also, we just saw whether you want selected networking, private endpoints, things like this. Security is something that I'll be covering in the day 4. This security is associated with Azure Defender. So right now you'll not see any data because there's nothing created here. You can look at the properties of it, and this is the vault URI, right? So within your code, for example, if you have a web app that needs to communicate to a SQL database, how would you access this vault? This is the URI using which you'll be accessing the vault and the keys within that. Right, so let's go ahead and create, let's take a simple example. Let's use it for password management, right? So let's go and create a password. So I'll go to secrets. I'll say upload options manual. I'll say my secret password. Right, it's just a name. I'll put in a password here. I can set the content type optional. This is more to do with grouping of your keys. I can set an expiry date. So I can say when is it active, when is it expired. So I can say from which date to which date is this password active. And I can enable or disable. So I'll leave the other things to default. I'll say enabled and I click create. Right now, this my secret password is created, and it creates versions. Right, so you can always update your passwords. Right, you'll not have the same password all the time, so you can keep updating it. And as and when you update it, it goes ahead and creates new versions of it. So this is the version number. Right now, if I click on this version, and if I need to access this particular password, this is the URL. Right, so it says the vault UI /keys / my secret password, and then a GUID, right? A complicated GUID. So with this access, I will be able to access my secret value. Okay. So I can definitely go ahead and update. For example, let's say if I want to set a new password on top of this, and I can still go ahead and do this. I can click create, and then like you see, it creates an updated version of that password, right? So this is the older version, this is the newer version. So let's say if you have QA environment, production environment, testing environment, there are times that applications are not upgraded at the same time. So you can still have different passwords available, but once the older password is expired, all you need to do is say enable to no, click save, and that older password is removed. I'll just click on no. Also, let's say if you want to access the latest password all the time, how do you do that? All you need to do is, instead of this URL, let me open up a notepad. Bring it here. So this is the identifier of your password, right? So if you always want to access the latest password, just remove this. If you just access using this, right, then you always will get the latest password associated or latest password stored in this particular secret. Okay. So this is Azure Key Vault in general. Now, if I quickly want to show a use case, let me open up the resource group once again. Key Vault. So in the same way, I've created another key, so known as Lab Key Vault D1, right? And even here, I have 2 versions, right? It's the same setup. Additionally, within the resource group, what I've also created is I've gone ahead and created a logic app, right? Now, in this logic app, I've gone ahead and defined, let me actually go ahead and create it. Now, before I go ahead and create this logic app, assuming, let's say this is the application which I'm developing. Firstly, this application should have access to my keyboard, right? So if you remember access policy, this particular logic app should first have access to my keyword. So how do I make sure that logic app has access to my keyword? Now, I don't have within the keyword, if I go back here, I don't have an option under access policy to select logic app, right? So what do? I will create something called as managed identity for the logic app. So if I go back again to my key vault, here under identities, right, under settings, under identity, I will go ahead and enable turn this system assigned identity. So what this does is it is basically giving an identity. Think of it as a GUID, as an identity for the entire service. Now, this particular identity becomes part of my Azure AD, and from Azure AD, I can give access to my keyword. So if I go back and click on this, and here, if you see access policies, I have added this. This is the managed identity that got generated. And now for this, what I've done is key permissions. I've not given anything because I don't need it to access key. I just need it to access secret. And even in secret, I just want it to get and display, right? Get in display or get in list. And even certificate, nothing. How did I add this? I clicked on add policy, go to service, select principal, and here I can search throughout my Azure AD. So as soon as you create a system generated managed ID, it is part of your Azure AD. And like any other object, you can give it access. So always remember, whenever you want to use keyword, you always have to give a service access to it. If you want your database to have access to keyword, again, create a system ID or a system identity for your SQL database and then add it as an access. That makes it more and more secure. So going back here, I've added it. And if I want to use this to retrieve the key, the secret, I'll just go ahead, say add. And here I have options where I can say Azure Key Vault. Yeah, Azure Key. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and get a secret, right? Name of my secret is my my secret password, right? That's it. So I'll save and go ahead and hit on run. Now, if I've set everything right, it should ideally show the password for me, right? So if I scroll down, as you can see, it shows me the password. And also it is showing me the latest password. It is not showing me the older one, right? So that is how I can use different services to go ahead, pull the data, push the data, and have them enabled or have them use Azure Keyword. Okay, I hope conceptually it is clearer. At a later stage when we talk about storage security, I'll also talk about how you can use disk encryption, how you can encrypt disk using Azure Keyword as well. So let me go back to the slides. Now, before I move on to the next topic, I'll just wait here for a second and let me know if anybody has any questions on Azure Keyword, its use case, how do you access it? Okay, I don't see any questions coming up. So this is one of the quiz questions that I have. This is again part of the Sabre giveaway that we are giving. So I would appreciate if you could participate in the poll and let me know. So this is a question. You create an Azure Key Vault that has the following configuration. Key Vault name is Vault 5, region is Australia East, resource group is RG1. You need to use Vault 5 to enable disk encryption for VM1. What Key Vault settings should you configure? I'd appreciate if everybody can participate in the poll. I'm sorry, in the quiz. Okay, I'll just wait for 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going ahead and ending the poll now. So thank you all for participating in the poll. Let me go ahead and share results. The correct answer is access policy. Now, like I said, before you enable or create secrets or keys, you first have to make sure that the virtual machine actually has access to Azure Key Vault. So the answer is access policies, right? So most of you gave the right answer. Locks is wrong, because locks basically stop you from deleting a service. Keys and secrets are not, I would say, they're not actually vault settings. These are vault features, right? So you can create keys, you can create secrets. The setting that you have to enable is access policies, because this is what allows you to actually use the service. So I hope that clears all the doubts that people have. Again, if you do have questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. So the next one is application security, right? So within application security, Microsoft has a feature called as Microsoft Identity Platform. So Microsoft Identity Platform is the platform on which you are able to use the Azure Active Directory to provide authentication to your applications. Now, let's take a consideration that you're building an application on Azure, right? And you want that application to use Azure AD, or you're building application even in AWS, but you want that application to use Azure AD for authentication. Your users and passwords and groups, everything is created in Azure AD, right? How do you configure it? That is where you would use Microsoft Identity Platform. It gives you a single location where you can go ahead, configure your applications, not only to authenticate, but you can even go to a level where you can configure consent, right? So I hope everybody is aware of what a consent is. Whenever you're logging into Office 365 or Microsoft 365, or let's say, for example, you have an application that you want to integrate with Office 365. For example, one of the applications that I use is Calendly for booking, right? For sharing my calendar and allowing people to book my calendar. If I need to give this third-party application access to my Office 365 calendar, I have to consent. I have to say, allow it to read my profile, allow it to read my calendar. It should be able to read and write into my calendar, right? So this is consent. So all those consent configuration are also possible using Microsoft Identity Platform. So that is what the Identity Platform provides. One of the important features that we'll be discussing today is app registration. So how you can create an app, how you can first register an app, right? Creating is all your coding and development and having a front and back end communication. But even before that, how do you make sure that you're able to register the app? What are the options? Can it only look at Azure AD? Can it look at other sources for authentication? Can you have multiples of them? Can you have it look at multiple Azure ADs as well? Right. So these are things that we'll look at in the demo and see what features and options are available. We'll also be looking at permissions. So a lot of customers today are not just using Azure AD, they have now started using all the services that Azure provides. Now, when I say Azure, Azure is the backend for both Microsoft 365, it's the backend for Azure Security, M365 Security, it's the backend for Dynamics as well. So a lot of backend APIs are now available within the Microsoft um, ecosystem, and identity platform or identity protection helps you assign permissions to these service APIs. So for example, let's say if you want to read and write data from, let's say, Teams, right? Would you be giving it delegate permission? So delegate means a user account is being delegated to access Azure, Teams APIs, or you're using service principals or application permissions where there is no user logged in, but you still want to be able to pull and push the data. So all these advanced services are part of identity management. Again, I'll like Key Vault, I'll go through the application registration, the various settings, because these are topics that make it more clearer in understanding once we go through the setup and look at the options and what you can change and not change. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay, so let's look at application registration. So application registration, like I said, is part of Active Directory. So let me go to Azure Active Directory. And here you have this option saying app registration, right? You also have something called as enterprise apps. So we'll also look at how these two are related. What is enterprise app? How does it, work with apps, things like this. So first, let's do a simple thing. Let's go ahead and create an app, right? So let's do a quick app registration. So whenever you want an app to trust Azure AD, or you want Azure AD to trust your app so that it is able to do authentication, this is the first thing that you do, right? So let's say test app, just the name. Now, what APIs should this application access, or what accounts would be accessing, would this application have access to? So accounts in organization only in my tenant, in multiple tenants. So this is your multi-tenant. So if you're creating application which is multi-tenant, typically they use the second or the third one. So in this, any customer who is using Office or Microsoft 365 or Azure AD will be able to interact with your application. The third one is not just Azure AD, but also personal accounts, right? So people can now authenticate to an application using Hotmail, Live ID, Outlook.com ID, so things like this. So that's what you can do. And the last one is just personal accounts, right? So for our scenario, I'll just stick to the first one. The next one is redirect URL. So once a user is authenticated, they have to be redirected to another page, right? Now, typically in a modern application setup, it's redirected to the home page of the application, or it is redirected to whatever is the first page of the application with respect to the user permission, right? So in our scenario, we have to give it a URL. So I'll use a test URL here, known as localhost, but this is what the redirect URI means. After authentication, what's the screen that the user will have access to? So I'll go ahead and click on register. So my app is now registered. So it gives a certain ID. So it has an application ID, tenant ID, object ID. It is now supported only within my tenant. It is one web application. I can still add a application ID URI here. So this is my application. So I can even check the endpoints. So all of those features and functionalities are available here, right? I can also do branding. For example, if I would like to have a new logo assigned to it, I can go ahead and upload a logo. So let me see if I have an image which I could use. Let's say if my photo works. Okay, so I'd use this as the logo. I can give terms of service, privacy. So these are definitely very, very important, especially when you're talking about enterprise applications, right? So you need to define what the home page is, what are the terms and conditions, privacy statements. So these are absolutely important when it comes to registering your application. Right, so I'll go ahead and click on save. So this is what are the branding options I have. Under authentication, I can look at what is the return URI, front end, front channel logout URI. So these are the various authentication chain URLs that you can define, and these are the supported account types currently that we have defined. I can go ahead and use certificates. So, for example, if your application is a web-based application and you want it to run on HTTPS, right? So that's where you can upload certificates for it, right? So all these things are possible. If I look at owners, these are the people who actually have access to the application in terms of changing authentication, changing URL, redirection URL. So these are the owners who would actually go ahead and do it. Manifest, I mean, there are a lot of options of app registration or application which are not available from the UI. A lot of them are available on JSON, or let's say you are a developer, you are more comfortable to make changes on the JSON. You can definitely go ahead and make changes here as well, right? So like you see the name, the logout URL currently is none. So if you would like to provide a URL here, like let's say logout.com, right? Something like this. So that is something that can be defined within the URI and provided access. Okay, so I can save and that becomes your logout URL. So going back a step, so this is now a global application. When I say global, this particular application is now accessible by everybody within my tenant, right? But let's say if I would like to first look at a local instance of this particular tenant, of this particular application, that is where it comes into my enterprise application. So think of enterprise application as a local instance of all your apps. So these are all the apps which are locally available, locally created within my tenant, which I have access to. And I should also have test app. And you see the logo is already being displayed. So it is an instance, it is a local instance. So you have a global instance under app registration, and you have a local instance inside your enterprise application. And here, all the things which are defined on the global level are, you can say, inherited, right? Inherited into this. For example, if I look at owners, I should be able to see, I should be able to add owners because I'm logged in as Roshan here, right? Uh, the app logo is being displayed to me, so it is being pulled from the global application registration. Also, this is where I can talk about or configure consent and permission. So this is, do I allow user consent? Do I not allow user consent, or allow only for a verified application, or allow user consent for all applications? So you can define how your users should consent, how your group of users or administrators also should consent to this application, right? So that at a very high level is what application registration is, and how enterprise applications and app registration work together. Now, if you are looking at an option to, let's say, I've created an app, we created a newer version, now I need to delete the older version, all you need to do is just click on delete and this application is deleted. Now, what happens, this is another question which I got from a partner saying, if I created a multi-tenant app, and if I go ahead and delete the app registration, what happens to the app? Will it be deleted everywhere, or will it just get deleted in the global service? So if it's a multi-tenant, it only gets deleted at the global level. You have to go ahead and delete it in each and every tenant under the enterprise apps, because you remember enterprise app is a local instance. So every tenant will get their own instance of the application. So you'll have to go ahead and delete each and every app, or the app from each enterprise administration. Okay, so that was a quick run through on app registration and how you can use um, applications. Let me also talk quickly about the permissions as well. So we spoke about how applications now have access to various uh, Azure APIs. So if you look at API permissions, by default it has Microsoft Graph. But if I say add permission, now let's say I would like to use I want this application to work with Defender, right? Windows Defender, yeah. So Windows Defender ATP, right? And here, delegated or applications. So delegated means that a user should have access to my Windows Defender as well. So it's a user account which is being delegated via the app, and then that user, for example, reads and writes alerts or looks into alerts. Let's say he's part of my support team, he needs to have access to alerts and notification from Windows Defender. That's where you would use delegate permission. So you're impersonating a user. Application, think of it as a background job, right? So think of it as a daemon job or a background job that doesn't really require a user to log in. So that is where you would use application permissions. So let's say if I say delegate permission, I should be alert, right? So here I can read and write alerts, right? So I can add this as a permission for that particular user, and then I should also be able to give him options of, okay, how should he consent, right? So if I leave this option as is, then every time the user logs in, he will be requested for consent, right? But as an administrator, I can say I will consent on behalf of all the users. So that is also an option. If I say grant admin consent for Ingram AUMPN, so I'm giving all users of Ingram AUMPN a grant access. I'm sorry, consent. So I'm, as an admin, I'm consenting on behalf of all the users who are part of my organization. And if they use this application, they will have read and write access to the Windows ATP alerts, right? So that is how the consent options can also be configured. Right? So for now, I'll just say no. So before I go to the next topic, any questions on app registration, enterprise apps, consent, API, permissions, any of these? So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to let me know. Okay, so let me jump on to the next topic. So the next topic is a very important topic known as managed identity. So we are already touched based on this when we were looking at Azure Key Vault. So what is managed identity? So I have a couple of snapshots in the upcoming slides where I'll explain you in more detail how you can use how you can use managed identity. So basically, managed identity is a way where you can assign identity to the service and have that identity access uh, other Azure services. For example, a virtual machine trying to access SQL, right? These are two different services, but here you do not want the configuration details to be stored within configuration file. You want it to be stored in Key Vault. So how do you make sure virtual machine is able to communicate with the Key Vault and then database? So that's where managed identity comes into place. Just give me 1 second here. I think I'm losing power on my laptop. Let me quickly connect the charger. Just give me a second. Okay, sorry for that, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. So I have a couple of slides where I'll explain you how managed identity actually works. So let's take the scenario. Let's say you have a application server and this particular application server communicates with database server, and you have the application code written and that basically accesses. Now, within the application code, you also have defined how you want to access this particular database. So basically your connection string, your configuration file is stored on the same, and using that you're able to access. Now, this is not a very good practice, right? So your security team will say, hey, you are storing passwords, you're storing all the information on the application server. It's easy to get access to the database and the data itself. So let's look at what are the other ways to do it. So the other way, we already saw this, is using Azure Key Vault, right? So now your app server doesn't have any secrets. It is all stored in Azure Key Vault. But you still need to make sure that your application is still able to has some information of Key Vault now, right? So your application should have the Key Vault URI, for example, right, in order to access it. Still, this is still in a way security problem. And let's say if your security team says, is there a way that nothing about my secrets, nothing about my passwords are stored in my database? For example, this, you don't want even this information, which is the Key Vault configuration, even this information to be stored. That is where managed identity comes in. So there are two types of managed identity. One is called system assigned and one is called user assigned. So first, let's look at system assigned, right? So in system assigned, what happens is there is an identity that gets created for this particular user, for this particular system. So let me bring out laser pointer. So this virtual machine itself gets an ID, right? So the entire virtual machine has an ID now, stored in Azure AD, and now you can go ahead and assign this ID access, contribute access to your database, right? So this definitely sounds like service principle, right? If you worked with security earlier, this is very similar to service principle. Yes, this is actually managed identity are like service principles itself, right? So here what is happening is your application code has no data about where your keys are stored, where your database is, anything. Your virtual machine itself is now having an ID, and that ID has access to the database, right? So this is one of the most secure way of accessing your applications. And this is what is managed identity, right? Now, if what happens if your database gets deleted, I'm sorry, if your application server is deleted, right? So if your application server is deleted, then even your IDs associated with those also get deleted, right? So this is a very good way of making sure you have access to applications without storing the information about those applications within your systems. So a quick demo, we've already seen this, so I'll quickly run through that particular demo once again. So like I said, for example, if I go back to the resource group and I should have a group saying managed identities, right? So let's say here I have this data virtual machine called test virtual machine. And let's say this virtual machine should now have access to this database. How do I do that? Right. One is you create an application code, then you configure Key Vault, and then have that Key Vault have access to this. So you can configure that. That's option one. Or if I go to this test virtual machine, and if I look at under settings, if I look at identity, all I have to do is system assigned. I'll say on, click save, right? Now this particular test virtual machine or this particular machine will get an ID, right? And that ID is called test. This is the object ID. And now if I want this virtual machine to have access to my database, how do I do that? So if I go back to managed ID demos, if I go to my database, here I can go to access control, right? Say add access. I can say contribute, and here I can select virtual machines, for example, and you see test is available, right? I can click save. Now this virtual machine, which now has an ID, now has access to my database, and it has read and write access, which is contribute, right? So here you see a virtual machine now has access to this. So this is what is system assigned identities. So there is another concept called as user assigned identity. So why do you need a user assigned identity? So let me give you a scenario. Let's say one application server makes sense, but let's say you have multiple application servers now, right? Which means you need to create multiple, each application server will have its own IDs, and you have to manually go ahead and assign permission to each and every managed system generated ID, system generated identity. So that's, I would say, cumbersome. It is possible, it's cumbersome. So this is where user assigned managed identity comes into play. So what you do is user assigned managed identity is independent of the resource. So it is independent of virtual machine. So what you do, you create a generic identity, user identity, assign that to virtual machine, and assign the same. As you can see, this is created in Azure AD. You assign this ID to each application, and then you assign this here to the database. This is user assigned managed identity, right? So given a choice between system assigned and user assigned, if you have multiple instances communicating to the database or to wherever your data is stored, use user defined identity. So let's look at a quick demo on that as well. Before I look at a quick demo, I quickly wanted to talk about the differences. So system assigned is associated with an Azure resource or created with an Azure resource. User assigned is independent. System assigned automatically gets deleted whenever the resource, the Azure resource, is deleted. User assigned is independent, right? So you have to manually go ahead and delete. System assigned, you cannot share it. The identity cannot be shared across multiple resources. User assigned, again, you can share it across multiple resources. So quick and simple scenario, very effective, especially when you talk about applications, and especially a lot of customers today deploy 2-tier, 3-tier applications on Azure, right? To make sure there are less and less entry points for unauthorized access, I strongly encourage you to use system assigned or user assigned identities. Okay. So let's look at a quick demo again, going back here. So managed identity, user assigned, as I said, is a completely different service. So if I search for managed identities, so this is where I can go ahead and create a user assigned managed identity. I'll put it in managed identity demos. I'll select region. I'll give it a name. Say Day3 user identity ID. Okay. View and create. And create. Right. So I've created independently of any virtual machine. No virtual machines are associated with this. Once it's created, if I go back, let's say if I go back to the same test virtual machine, and if I go to identity, here you see I have system assigned, I have user assigned. And here I can get this Day3 user ID. And the same ID is also possible to be assigned at my database as well. So if I go here, I say control access, I'll say add, and here if I select, let's say contribute, here do I have a filter? No, but if I search Day3 user ID, right? So if I click on save, that is also possible, right? So very simple option to create very security. There are a lot of benefits around security for identities. Okay. So let me quickly cover the storage security. So Azure storage security is very essential and important. There are different types of storages available within Azure. You have blob storage, files, and you have tables and queues. But today we'll be talking about blobs and files. Again, there are different ways of giving permission to storage. You can give Azure AD based authentication storage. This is a new service that is available within Azure. Sorry, the slide is slightly old. It is not only Azure AD domain services. You can now use, this, let me remove this. The feature which is now in preview is no more in preview. This is live, right? So it is possible for Azure files now to be accessible by using Windows authentication or Azure AD authentication, not just domain services, right? So this is now completely supported. So you have different ways of accessing. This scenario is very important, because now you can have file server synced with Azure files directly, and the folder and file level permission can be provided to those files which are synced, right? So this is one of the use cases of having Active Directory authentication with Azure files. Storage at encryption, like I said, any data that is stored on Azure is encrypted by default. It uses 256-bit encryption. Now, I would not encourage you to go ahead and change this encryption, because it is managed, maintained by Microsoft. Microsoft keeps changing the keys and making sure the keys are refreshed, and the security is always their highest priority. But if you do have customers who want to bring in their own keys or want to use Azure Key Vault for protection, you can definitely use customer managed keys instead of Microsoft managed, and provide your own encryption to that particular storage. Secure transfer, again, I would say this has to be enabled by default. Microsoft doesn't enable this, but you can always make sure that any connections coming into your storage is always coming from an HTTPS or a secure location. So by default, it is disabled. Make sure you enable it and have access to that particular storage. Shared access signature, again, this is fine-grained permission management of storage. So if you would like to make sure that users have only read or read write from certain time, from let's say today to 1 week, so that is where you would actually use shared access signature. So it is very detailed, fine-grained permission access management on your storage that's available within Azure. Excuse me. The last but not the least is retention policy. So again, it's very important to enable retention policies on your storage, because that's where your data is being stored. So it can be time-based, it can be legal hold. So when you enable legal hold, no editing or deleting of the data is possible. So especially when it comes to compliance and auditing, legal hold becomes very essential. This concept is also available in Microsoft 365, where you can assign legal hold to SharePoint documents, SharePoint online documents, or mailboxes. The same legal hold concept is also available for storage. Last but not the least, the one that I already discovered, Azure Files Authentication. This now supports Active Directory and Azure AD domain services. So Azure AD domain services authentication was available for quite some time. Azure AD authentication is now possible. Some of the use cases, for example, Windows Virtual Desktop actually uses the same use case, where Windows Virtual Desktop, if you have Azure AD synced with, if you have Windows AD synced with Azure AD, and if you have Windows Virtual Desktop deployed, user profiles data is stored in Azure files. So how can a user who's synced use Windows Virtual Desktop and still have his profile in Azure files? This concept helps you do that. That's one use case. Second use case is making sure you have file server. Let's say if you have an on-prem file server which you want to move to cloud, and SharePoint and Teams is not the way you're looking forward to implement it. You want to have Windows Explorer format of accessing the data, then you use Azure Files. Sync it. You can still continue to use NTFS permissions on those folders which are synced. Okay, so let me quickly do a run through of this particular storage security, and then I think we should be able to end this session. Sorry, I'm running a little over time. I'll quickly try to cover the storage security concepts as well. So storage security, I have a different resource group created. So when you create a storage account, so you have different settings available when it comes to encryption. So like I said, by default, it is managed by Microsoft encryption. So any data going into Azure is always encrypted, right? This is one of their, I would say, features of Azure, right? But if you'd like to provide your own encryption, you have an option where you can select a key vault. This is again a key vault use case as well, or you can enter, let's say they have their own encryption mechanism and they want to use that. You can use key URI and use the subscription wherever it is running, right? So this is how you can do encryptions on the storage account as a whole, and it is supported for both blobs and files. Shared access signature. So like I said, if you want detailed permission access management. So for example, like you see here, allow services. I do not want people to have access to, let's say, files, queues, and tables. I want them to have access only to blob, right? And they should only be able to read and list, right? Read and display, and enable deletion of versions. I'll say no. From what time to what time? Allowed public IP, allowed protocol. So if you want to give a really fine grained access to your applications, then you use shared access signature, right? One of the other ways is to use access keys. So you have a storage account and access key, but whenever you need to change, you have to recreate the keys again and again. So it's not a very secure way of accessing data. Shared access signature is probably the best way to go ahead and implement um, access policies for your storage. Networking. This is something that we already covered. You can use uh, service endpoints, or you can use private endpoints in order to access. So let's say you want this storage to be accessed by certain networks only, then you can go ahead and configure it here. And you can do a combination, right? You can do certain networks only, and you can use shared access signature, saying that, okay, only from this network, they can only have access to, let's say, only Azure files, and only from this time to this time, or only from these allowed IP addresses from that within that network as well. So you can go ahead and tailor or narrow down your security to a very great extent and provide much more security options onto it. Okay, so these are things which I wanted to quickly cover around storage security. If you have any questions, now is the time you can go ahead and ask your questions. Okay, so there are no questions coming up. So, well, folks, keeping the time in mind, I think this is a good time to end the session. Thank you very much for taking out time and joining in today's session. I hope the session was helpful and informative. I tried to incorporate a lot of demos into the session. Sorry, we ran over a little. I think we're 11 minutes over time. But thank you for sticking around and participating in the polls. Let me see if I have any other questions now. So there are no other questions. We have one question saying that API is how you can tie with the Azure Key Vault. Mark, I'm assuming this question is with respect to app registration. If your question is how you can tie up app registration or delegate permission or assigned permission to Key Vault, answer is yes. That's how you can do that. If not, if my answer is not right, just rephrase your question and let me know. Okay, so thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating in today's session. Hope the session was helpful and informative. Do join us in the last session, which is on the 31st, where we'll be covering Azure Defender and Azure Sentinel. It's a very interesting session, so do join that session and participate in the questionnaires, and hopefully you will learn many more topics there as well. So thank you very much for joining in today. I will be available on the chat for the next 10 minutes. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. Thank you and have a great day ahead.